I'm not really one to spill my guts online, but I've been carrying this weight for a while now. It feels like I'm stuck with this mess in my head, and maybe sharing it here will help me work through it, or at least keep me from going crazy. My name's Ethan. I'm 36, and until recently, I thought I was living the kind of life you see in those feel-good family movies. You know the ones: hardworking dad, supportive wife, 2 great kids, a successful small business, and a community that respects you. I guess you could say I bought into the dream. And for a long time, it felt real. I grew up in a small town where everybody knows everybody. My dad ran a landscaping business, and he believed in teaching me the value of hard work from an early age. Summers meant mowing lawns, planting trees, and sweating under the sun while my friends went to the pool or played video games. It wasn't easy, but looking back, I can honestly say those lessons shaped me. When my dad retired, I took over the business and turned it into something bigger than either of us imagined. That same small-town life brought me Sarah. I met her at a friend's barbecue when we were in our 20s. She was beautiful, no doubt, but it wasn't just her looks that drew me in. She had this energy, this drive. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room with her laugh or hold her own in a debate about politics or sports. I was smitten from the start. We dated for a couple of years, and when I proposed, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Everyone said we were a perfect match. We got married in a cozy backyard ceremony and started building our life together. We had 2 kids, Lila, who's 10 now, and Jake, who's 8. They're my whole world. For a while, everything was great. Sure, we had our challenges, who doesn't? Raising kids, managing a business, and juggling life isn't easy, but we made it work. Or at least I thought we did. Looking back, the cracks started to show about a year ago. At first, it was little things. Sarah started spending more time on her phone, scrolling through Instagram or texting late at night. She seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else even when we were sitting right next to each other. I told myself it was just stress, maybe she needed space or a break from the routine. But then there were the excuses. She'd come home late from work more often, saying she'd stayed to finish a project or catch up on emails. Our date nights became fewer and far between, and when we did manage to go out, it felt like she was just going through the motions. Even our conversations shifted. We used to talk about everything: our dreams, our fears, our plans for the future. Now, it was all surface-level stuff: schedules, bills, the kids' activities. And then there was the bedroom. It's not like we ever had issues in that department before, but lately, let's just say the spark was gone. I told myself this was normal, that every couple goes through lulls. After all, we'd been together for over a decade. Maybe this was just one of those rough patches people talk about. I wanted to believe that so badly. I wanted to believe we were okay. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't until I accidentally stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see that my whole world came crashing down. This is the story of how I found out my perfect life wasn't so perfect after all, and how I'm trying to pick up the pieces. It all started with the most random thing. One evening, I was sitting at my desk, taking a quick break after a long day at work. I'd been mapping out some landscaping ideas for a big project and decided to poke around on Google Earth for inspiration. Weird, I know, but sometimes I like to look at properties and see how people design their outdoor spaces. As I was scrolling around, something caught my eye: a car parked in front of my house. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't Sarah's. It was an unfamiliar black sedan, and for some reason, it just didn't sit right with me. I zoomed in, squinting at the grainy image, trying to make sense of it. My stomach did this weird flip when I noticed 2 people standing near the car. One of them was Sarah. I could recognize her figure anywhere, the way she stands, the slope of her shoulders. But it was the person next to her that had me frozen. A man. They were close, and as I zoomed in as far as I could, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. She was kissing him. I stared at the screen, willing myself to see something else, to convince myself it was just a trick of the camera or my mind playing games. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. That was my wife, Sarah, kissing another man outside our home. At first, I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for logical explanations. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was an old image. Maybe this guy was a long-lost cousin, and I was seeing it wrong. But deep down, I knew. I knew. The more I stared at the photo, the more details came into focus. The man she was kissing looked familiar, though I couldn't quite place him at first. Then it hit me like a freight train. It was Ben. Ben Clausen, her ex-boyfriend. The one she dated on and off before she met me. My chest tightened, and I could feel my heart pounding. My hands shook as I shut the laptop, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with this information. Should I confront her? Should I wait and gather more evidence? Should I ignore it and hope it was a one-time thing? I couldn't ignore it. My gut wouldn't let me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that image of Sarah and Ben. I replayed every moment in my head, searching for signs I'd missed. The late nights. The distracted conversations. The way she seemed to light up whenever she got a text. It was like all the little pieces of the puzzle I'd ignored or dismissed were suddenly falling into place, and the picture they painted wasn't one I wanted to see. The next day, I decided to do something I never thought I'd have to do. I started digging. I couldn't let it fester any longer. Every time I looked at Sarah, that image of her and Ben flashed in my mind like a neon sign. It was driving me insane. I needed answers, no matter how much they might hurt. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I decided it was time. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone, while Sarah sat across from me, lost in whatever TV show she was watching. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Sarah," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, startled. "We need to talk." She paused the show and raised an eyebrow. "Okay, what's going on?" I took a deep breath, gripping the edge of the couch for support. "I saw something, on Google Earth. Something that doesn't make sense. I need you to explain it to me." Her face immediately paled, and for a split second, I thought I saw a panic flash in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual, but I could hear the tension creeping in. I didn't sugarcoat it. "I saw you, Sarah. Outside our house. With him. With Ben." She froze, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. The color drained from her face completely, and she let out a shaky laugh. "Ethan, that's ridiculous. Google Earth. Come on, those images are old and..." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Don't lie to me. Don't insult me like that. I know what I saw." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging between us. For a moment, I thought she might deny it again, but then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a sigh. "Fine," she said softly, barely above a whisper. "You're right. It was me." Her admission hit me like a gut punch. Even though I'd known, hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. My stomach twisted, and my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. "How long?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay composed. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, and I could see the battle in her mind, lie or tell the truth. Finally, she answered. "A few months." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. "Why, Sarah? Why him? Why now? Is this because you're unhappy? Is it something I did?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "It's not about you, Ethan. It's not like that. I don't even know how it started. We ran into each other a while back, and I don't know. It just happened. It just happened. I repeated, my voice rising. That's the best you've got? You're blowing up our family because it just happened. Do you even understand what you've done? She started crying then, big, heaving sobs, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not this time. I felt like I was drowning, my world crumbling around me. The woman I thought I knew, the life we'd built together, it all felt like a lie. I'm sorry, she whispered through her tears. I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what's wrong with me. I didn't say anything for a long time. I couldn't. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was all too much. Finally, I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving her there with her guilt and her tears. I needed to breathe. I needed to think. The confrontation gave me some of the answers I was looking for, but it left me with 100 more questions, and a heart that felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces. After that confrontation, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up the entire night, replaying everything Sarah had said, or didn't say, in my head. I tried to make sense of it, but no matter how hard I thought about it, I couldn't find a way to justify her actions. Every excuse she gave felt hollow, every tear she shed felt like too little, too late. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring out the window into the dark. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the hum of the refrigerator. This was supposed to be our home, the place we'd built together, but now it felt like a stranger's house, a place full of memories that were suddenly tainted. The betrayal cut deep. It wasn't just that Sarah had been unfaithful, it was that she'd made me doubt everything. I started questioning myself, wondering if I'd been blind to her unhappiness or if I'd missed signs that could have prevented this. Was I not good enough? Was I too focused on the business? Too comfortable? Too boring? The worst part was knowing that this wasn't just about me, it was about our kids, too. Lila and Jake had no idea what was going on, and the thought of them finding out terrified me. They deserved a stable home, parents who loved each other, and a childhood free of this kind of pain. How was I supposed to explain any of this to them? The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions, dropping the kids off at school, showing up to work, and pretending everything was normal. But inside, I felt like I was falling apart. Anger would bubble up out of nowhere, and I'd find myself gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Other times, the sadness hit me like a wave, and I had to fight back tears while standing in line at the grocery store. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not my friends, not even my closest coworker, Mark, who's been like a brother to me. I couldn't. Admitting what had happened felt too humiliating, like it was some kind of reflection on me or my failure to keep my marriage together. One night, after I put the kids to bed, I broke down. I sat on the couch and just let it all out, tears, anger, frustration, everything I'd been holding in. I screamed into a pillow until my throat hurt, punched the armrest of the couch until my hand throbbed, and finally crumpled into a heap, exhausted and empty. I didn't feel better afterward, but at least I felt something. By the time Sarah came downstairs, I was sitting in the dark, staring at the wall. She tried to say something, an apology, maybe, but I held up my hand to stop her. Not tonight, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this tonight. She nodded silently and went back upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, I realized something important, I couldn't let her betrayal define me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had to find a way to move forward, not just for me, but for my kids. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I couldn't look at Sarah without feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. I knew we couldn't go on like this, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Something had to give. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat Sarah down in the living room. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy from crying, though whether it was from guilt or genuine regret, I couldn't tell. I'd spent days agonizing over what to do, and I was finally ready to have the conversation that would change everything. "We need to talk about what's next," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. She nodded, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I know," she said softly. "I've been trying to figure out how to fix this, but I don't even know where to start." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the life we'd built together and find a way to repair the damage. But another part of me, the part that couldn't forget what I'd seen and heard, knew that some things couldn't be undone. "Do you even want to fix it?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Because if you do, I need to hear it from you. I need to know that you're willing to fight for this." She hesitated, and in that pause, my heart sank. Finally, she said, "I don't know, Ethan. I'm so sorry for what I've done to you, to us, to the kids. But I feel so lost. I don't know who I am anymore." Her honesty was like a knife to the gut. I'd been holding out hope that she'd beg me to stay, that she'd promise to do whatever it took to make things right. But instead, she was admitting that she didn't even know if she wanted to try. I leaned back on the couch, rubbing my hands over my face. "Sarah, I can't do this alone. I can't be the only one trying to hold this together. If you're not willing to put in the work, then I don't see how we can move forward." She started crying, and I could feel my own tears threatening to spill. "I want to try," she said between sobs. "I do. But I don't even know where to start." "You start by being honest," I said, my voice trembling. "With me, with yourself, with the kids. And then we figure out if there's anything left to save." We sat in silence for a long time after that, neither of us knowing what to say. Deep down, I think we both knew the truth: our marriage was on life support, and the chances of saving it were slim. The next day, I called a lawyer. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one that felt right. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. I had to protect myself and my kids, even if it meant walking away from the life I thought I'd have forever. When I told Sarah about my decision, she didn't argue. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face, and said, "I understand." It wasn't the resolution I wanted, but it was the one I needed. Now came the hard part, untangling our lives and figuring out what came next. Filing for divorce was like ripping off a band-aid, painful but necessary. The lawyer I hired was straightforward and professional, but even with their guidance, the process was overwhelming. I was suddenly faced with decisions I never thought I'd have to make: dividing assets, figuring out custody arrangements, and trying to explain the situation to Lila and Jake without completely shattering their world. Telling the kids was, by far, the hardest part. Sarah and I sat them down one evening after dinner. Lila, being older, could tell something was off even before we said anything. Jake, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware, still laughing at whatever silly video he'd just watched on his tablet. "Kids," I started, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Your mom and I have something important to talk to you about." Sarah took over from there, her voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes, grown-ups don't get along as well as they used to. And when that happens, they have to make some hard decisions." Lila's face immediately crumpled. "Are you getting a divorce?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, sweetie. But it doesn't mean we love you any less. That will never change." Jake looked back and forth between us, confusion written all over his face. "So, we're not going to live together anymore?" he asked. I swallowed hard, fighting the lump in my throat. "No, buddy. But you're still going to see both of us all the time. We'll make sure of that." Lila started crying, and Jake followed soon after, even though I wasn't sure he fully understood what was happening. I pulled them both into a hug, promising them over and over that everything was going to be okay, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and difficult conversations. Word of our divorce spread quickly in our small town, and the gossip mill kicked into high gear. I could see the pitying looks from neighbors and hear the whispers when I walked into the grocery store or dropped the kids off at school. What made it worse was that Sarah's affair didn't stay a secret for long. People started putting the pieces together, seeing her with Ben, noticing the tension between us. I didn't set out to publicly expose her, but the truth has a way of coming out. When it did, it wasn't just our marriage that took a hit, her reputation did, too. Sarah's job at a local nonprofit was suddenly on shaky ground. She'd always been seen as a respected figure in the community, but now, people looked at her differently. She became withdrawn, avoiding social events and staying home more often. As much as I wanted to feel vindicated, all I felt was sadness, for her, for me, and for the family we'd lost. The custody arrangements were straightforward, at least. The kids would stay with me most of the time, with Sarah having them every other weekend. She didn't fight me on it, knowing that I'd been the more stable presence in their lives during all of this. Still, seeing her pack up her things and leave the house for good was one of the most gut-wrenching moments of my life. For a while, everything felt broken. The house was too quiet without Sarah's presence, even if it had been tense lately. The kids were struggling to adjust, and I was doing my best to be there for them, even though I was barely holding it together myself. The fallout from the divorce was messy and painful, but in the end, it was also a step towards something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. The first few weeks after Sarah moved out were a whirlwind of adjustment. The house felt eerily empty without her presence. Even though things between us had been strained for a long time, the silence that followed her departure was deafening. I tried to fill the void by focusing on the kids and throwing myself into work, but there was no escaping the weight of what had happened. The kids had their own ways of dealing with the change. Lila, who had always been more sensitive, became withdrawn and quiet. She spent hours in her room, sketching in her notebook or reading, avoiding conversations unless absolutely necessary. Jake, on the other hand, seemed to cling to me more than ever. He'd follow me around the house, asking a million questions or insisting we play catch in the backyard. It was like he was afraid I might leave, too. I did my best to keep things as normal as possible for them. I kept up with our nightly routines, homework at the kitchen table, dinner together, bedtime stories. I even tried to make weekends fun by taking them to the park or the movies. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shield them from the reality of our broken family. One night, after I'd tucked Jake into bed, Lila came downstairs and sat on the couch next to me. She didn't say anything at first, just curled up with her knees to her chest and stared at the floor. Finally, she spoke. "Do you hate Mom?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "No, Lila. I don't hate your mom. I'm angry at her, and I'm hurt by what happened, but I could never hate her. She's your mom, and she loves you more than anything." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't understand why this happened. Neither did I. But I couldn't tell her that. Instead, I pulled her into a hug and said, "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes hurt the people they love. But what happened between your mom and me isn't your fault. None of this is your fault." She cried then, burying her face in my shoulder, and all I could do was hold her and let her feel what she needed to feel. That moment broke me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I hated that my kids had to carry the weight of something they didn't ask for, that they had to grow up faster because of our mistakes. On top of the emotional toll, I was struggling to keep everything else together. Running the business, managing the household, and being a full-time dad felt like a juggling act where I was always one misstep away from dropping everything. There were nights when I barely slept, my mind racing with worries about bills, the kids, and the future. And then there was the loneliness. After the kids went to bed, the house felt oppressively quiet. I missed having someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone to share the small victories and frustrations with. Even though I was still angry at Sarah, there were moments when I caught myself reaching for my phone to text her about something funny Jake said or to ask her advice about Lila. Old habits die hard, I guess. I wasn't ready to start dating again, hell, I wasn't even ready to think about it. But the thought of being alone forever terrified me. I'd built my entire adult life around being a husband and a father, and now I was left wondering who I was without those things. Every day felt like a new challenge, a new test of my strength. But through it all, I kept going. For Lila, for Jake, and maybe, in some small way, for myself. The months following the divorce were some of the toughest of my life, but eventually, I started to find a rhythm. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close, but it was a start. I learned how to juggle the chaos of single parenthood and running my business, though some days felt like I was just barely holding it all together. The mornings were the hardest. I'd wake up to an empty side of the bed, the stark reminder of everything that had changed. But then, I'd hear the kids stirring down the hall, and it gave me purpose. They were the reason I dragged myself out of bed and faced the world, even on the days when I felt like collapsing. The business became my outlet. I threw myself into it like never before, not just to stay afloat financially but because it was the one area of my life where I felt in control. Expanding the landscaping company had always been a goal, and now I had the motivation to make it happen. I started taking on bigger projects, hiring more people, and even branching out into garden design consulting. The busier I stayed, the less time I had to dwell on what I'd lost. At home, I focused on making things as stable as possible for Lila and Jake. We established new routines, movie nights every Friday, Sunday morning pancake breakfasts, and even a silly tradition of karaoke battles in the living room. I wanted them to feel like life could still be fun, even if it looked different than before. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Lila was still struggling, and it showed in her grades and her attitude. She started pushing back on rules she used to follow without question, testing boundaries like she was looking for a fight. One evening, after she stormed off to her room over something as small as taking out the trash, I followed her and sat on the edge of her bed. "Lila," I said gently, "I know things have been hard lately. And I know you're angry, and maybe you don't even know why. But I need you to talk to me. I need to know what's going on in that head of yours." She sat there for a while, staring at her hands, before finally looking up at me. "I just miss how things used to be," she said, her voice breaking. "I miss when we were all together, and I hate that we're not anymore. And I hate that I can't fix it." Hearing her say those words broke my heart, but I kept my composure. "I know, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug. "I miss it, too. But you don't have to fix anything. That's not your job. Your job is to be a kid and let me and Mom figure out the rest." Jake was handling things a little better, or so it seemed. He was young enough that he adapted quickly, but I could see the cracks in his cheerful demeanor. He asked about Sarah a lot, wanting to know when he'd see her next or why she couldn't come to every soccer game. I did my best to reassure him, even when the questions stung. In the midst of it all, I started reconnecting with myself. I picked up old hobbies I'd long abandoned, fishing, woodworking, even hitting the gym a few mornings a week. It wasn't about reinventing myself but rather rediscovering the parts of me I'd lost in the chaos of marriage and parenthood. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like a whole person again, not just a guy trying to keep his head above water. And then there was Dawn. She came into my life unexpectedly, through a mutual friend who insisted I needed to get out of the house more. Dawn was kind, down to earth, and easy to talk to. We started as friends, but over time, our connection grew into something more. She wasn't trying to fill a void or fix me, and I wasn't looking for someone to replace Sarah. It just worked. It was far from perfect. Dating as a single dad came with its own set of challenges, but it was a step forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rebuilding. To be continued. As life started to settle into a new rhythm, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the upheaval, it had all left scars, but it had also taught me things I never expected to learn. One of the biggest realizations was how much I'd lost myself over the years. My identity had been so wrapped up in being Sarah's husband and the kids' dad that I'd stopped thinking about who I was outside of those roles. Looking back, I could see how it had started, putting my own needs aside for the sake of the family, telling myself it was the right thing to do. But in the process, I'd let parts of me fade away. Sarah's betrayal forced me to confront that. It was like someone had ripped away the facade of my perfect life and shown me the cracks I'd been ignoring. As painful as it was, it gave me a chance to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. I also started to see Sarah in a different light. For a long time, I'd only thought about her as the woman who'd hurt me, the one who'd thrown away everything we'd built. But the more I reflected, the more I realized she was human, just like me. She'd made terrible choices, no doubt, but I couldn't ignore the fact that we'd both contributed to the breakdown of our marriage. I hadn't been as present as I thought I was. I'd let the business take priority too often, assuming she'd always be there, steady and unchanging. That didn't excuse her actions, of course. Nothing could. But understanding the dynamics of our relationship helped me let go of some of the anger I'd been carrying. Holding on to it wasn't helping anyone, least of all me. Then there were the kids. If there was one thing I was sure of, it was that they deserved better. They deserved parents who could communicate and co-parent without letting their own baggage get in the way. It wasn't easy. Some days, Sarah and I could barely look at each other without tension rising, but we made it work for their sake. We started having monthly family meetings to discuss schedules, school events, and anything else that needed coordination. Over time, it became less awkward and more functional. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were, smiling at the beach, carving pumpkins, celebrating birthdays. For a moment, I let myself remember the good times, not to dwell on what was lost, but to remind myself that those moments were real. They were part of my story, even if the ending hadn't turned out the way I'd hoped. If I could go back and change things, would I? The honest answer was no. As much as it hurt, the journey had shaped me into a better version of myself. It taught me resilience, humility, and the importance of truly being present for the people I love. It also taught me that sometimes, letting go is the only way to move forward. Now, when I look at Sarah, I see a woman who's still figuring herself out, just like I am. She's remarried now, and while we'll never be close, we found a way to coexist for the sake of Lila and Jake. And that's enough. What I've learned is this: life doesn't always go the way you plan, and people don't always turn out to be who you thought they were. But if you let it, even the hardest experiences can teach you something about yourself. And sometimes, the only way to find peace is to stop looking backward and start building something new. Even as I found some semblance of stability in my life, the challenges of moving on kept coming, each one testing me in new and unexpected ways. Divorce doesn't just end with signing the papers, it lingers, weaving its way through every aspect of your life, especially when kids are involved. Co-parenting with Sarah was one of the hardest parts. We managed to keep things civil for the kids, but there were still moments of tension. Sometimes it was small stuff, like disagreements over how to handle Jake's bedtime routine or Lila's extracurricular activities. Other times, it was bigger, like when Sarah told me she and her new husband were planning a vacation with the kids, and I felt a pang of jealousy and resentment that surprised me. It wasn't about her anymore, it was about someone else stepping into a role that used to be mine. The first time Jake came home and told me how much fun he had with Mom's new husband, I forced a smile and nodded, but inside, I felt like I'd been sucker punched. Rationally, I knew it was a good thing that they liked him. Emotionally, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Then there was the world of dating, something I hadn't even thought about in over a decade. Dawn was still in my life, and we were taking things slow, but dating as a single dad in your mid-30s was a whole new ballgame. Between work, the kids, and co-parenting, I barely had time to breathe, let alone build a new relationship. Dawn was patient, though. She understood the complexities of my situation and never pushed me to move faster than I was ready for. That was part of what made her so different from Sarah. With Dawn, there were no games, no hidden agendas, just honesty and a quiet kind of support that I hadn't realized I needed. Even so, the guilt crept in sometimes. I worried about how my kids would feel if they saw me with someone new. Would they think I was trying to replace their mom? Would they resent me for moving on? I tiptoed around the subject for months, only introducing Dawn to them casually as a friend. It wasn't until Jake blurted out, "Dad, is Dawn your girlfriend?" during dinner one night that I realized I couldn't avoid the conversation forever. "Yes," I admitted, glancing nervously at Lila. "She is. And I hope you're okay with that." Jake shrugged and kept eating his pizza like it was no big deal. Lila, on the other hand, put her fork down and studied me for a long moment. "As long as she's nice to you," she said finally. "And she doesn't try to take Mom's place." "She would never," I assured her. "Nobody could ever take your mom's place." It was a small moment, but it felt like a weight had been lifted. I knew there would be more hurdles ahead, but at least I was on the right track. Work was another challenge. The business was thriving, but the pressure to keep it growing was relentless. Some days, I felt like I was running on fumes, juggling client meetings, employee management, and long hours on site. There were nights when I'd finally collapse into bed only to wake up a few hours later, my mind already racing with everything I had to do the next day. But even in the chaos, there were bright spots. Seeing a project come together, watching the kids laugh during one of our impromptu karaoke nights, or even just sitting on the porch with a beer after a long day, those moments reminded me that life, while messy and unpredictable, could still be beautiful. The journey wasn't over yet, and I knew there were more challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just treading water. As time went on, I started to feel a sense of balance creeping back into my life. It wasn't perfect, and there were still plenty of ups and downs, but I was beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Slowly, I was learning how to thrive instead of just survive. One of the biggest shifts was in how I approached parenting. After the divorce, I'd spent so much energy trying to shield Lila and Jake from the fallout that I hadn't really allowed myself to enjoy being their dad. But as things settled down, I started focusing on the little moments, helping Jake build his latest Lego masterpiece, teaching Lila how to bake cookies, or just sitting on the couch watching silly movies together. These moments weren't just about them, they were about me, too. They reminded me why I kept going, even on the hardest days. Dawn became a bigger part of our lives, though we were still taking things one step at a time. She was incredible with the kids, kind, patient, and genuinely interested in their lives. She never tried to overstep her role or replace Sarah, which I think made Lila and Jake more comfortable around her. Watching her help Jake with his math homework or cheer Lila on at a soccer game made me realize how much I valued her presence, not just as a partner but as someone who truly cared about my family. Sarah and I had also found a more functional rhythm in our co-parenting. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but we were learning how to communicate without letting our past get in the way. We even managed to have a few civil conversations about the kids' future, like planning for Lila's middle school transition and figuring out how to support Jake's growing interest in science. One unexpected development came when Lila started asking questions about the divorce, deeper questions than before. "Why did you and Mom stop loving each other?" she asked one evening as we were cleaning up the dinner table. I paused, carefully considering my response. It's not that we stopped loving each other, I said finally. It's more that we changed. We weren't the same people we were when we got married, and we didn't handle those changes very well. But that doesn't mean we stopped loving you and Jake. That's something that will never change. She nodded thoughtfully, seeming to accept the answer, but her question stayed with me long after she went to bed. It reminded me that healing wasn't just something I had to work on, it was something my kids needed, too. Work continued to be both a challenge and a refuge. The landscaping business was thriving, and I was proud of what I'd built, but I also realized I needed to create better boundaries. For years, I'd let the business consume me, using it as an escape from everything else. Now, I was learning how to delegate more, trust my team, and carve out time for myself and my family. As I started prioritizing my own well-being, I picked up some old hobbies again, fishing on quiet mornings, woodworking projects in the garage, even joining a local hiking group. These small acts of self-care reminded me that I was more than just a dad or a business owner, I was a person with my own interests and needs. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was getting my footing. Life was still messy and unpredictable, but it was also full of moments of joy, growth, and connection. I wasn't just piecing my life back together, I was building something new, something that felt stronger and more authentic than what I'd had before. The journey wasn't over, but I was finally starting to feel like I was exactly where I needed to be. As the years passed, the life I was rebuilding started to feel more solid. It wasn't without its challenges, but I had grown more comfortable with the unpredictability of it all. I was learning to embrace the idea that life didn't have to follow the script I had once imagined. One of the biggest surprises was how much I began to open myself up to new experiences. Before, I had been so focused on stability, on doing everything right, that I hadn't realized how much I was missing. Now, I was starting to live in the moment, taking chances, and exploring parts of life that I'd overlooked for years. With Dawn, things had slowly but steadily deepened. What started as a cautious connection had grown into a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. She wasn't just someone who understood my past, she supported my future. She encouraged me to take time for myself and reminded me that I didn't have to carry everything on my shoulders. It wasn't just about our relationship, though. Dawn also helped me see the importance of building a village, a support network of friends, family, and even coworkers who had my back. For years, I'd prided myself on being self-reliant, but now I realized there was strength in leaning on others. I started reconnecting with old friends, joining community events, and letting people into my life in ways I hadn't before. The kids were thriving, too. Lila had become a confident, creative teenager, pouring her energy into art and drama club at school. Watching her perform in her first play brought tears to my eyes, partly because I was so proud and partly because I knew how far we'd come as a family. Jake, ever the curious one, had taken a liking to science and engineering. His bedroom was full of experiments and contraptions that I didn't always understand but encouraged anyway. One evening, as we were sitting around the dinner table, Jake asked me, "Dad, are you happy now?" The question caught me off guard. I put down my fork and looked at him, then at Lila, who had stopped scrolling through her phone to watch me. "You know what?" I said after a moment. "I think I am. It's taken me a while to get here, and there are still tough days, but yeah, I'm happy. And a big part of that is because of you too." Lila gave me a small smile, and Jake nodded as if he understood. It was a simple exchange, but it felt monumental. I realized that, for the first time in years, I wasn't just pretending to be okay for the sake of the kids. I genuinely was. I also started thinking more about the future, not just for the kids, but for myself. For years, I had operated in survival mode, focusing only on getting through the next day or the next crisis. Now, I was allowing myself to dream again. I thought about expanding the business even further, maybe opening another location. I considered traveling more, showing the kids places they'd only seen in books or on TV. And then there was Dawn. We hadn't talked about marriage, and neither of us was in a rush, but I could see her becoming a permanent part of my life. She had brought so much light into our world, and I couldn't imagine facing the future without her by my side. Life wasn't perfect, far from it. There were still moments of doubt, lingering anger, and the occasional tough day. But those moments no longer defined me. Instead, they served as reminders of how far I'd come and how much I'd grown. I wasn't just moving forward, I was embracing the possibilities of what lay ahead. As much as I tried to focus on the future, the past had a way of creeping back in. It wasn't something I could avoid forever, and eventually, I realized I had to confront it head-on if I truly wanted to move forward. Forgiveness, both of Sarah and myself, became the final piece of the puzzle. For years, I carried a mix of anger and sadness toward Sarah. Even after we found a stable rhythm in co-parenting, the betrayal lingered like a shadow. Every time I thought I'd made peace with it, something would trigger those old feelings, a comment from one of the kids, an unexpected memory, or even just seeing her with her new husband. It was exhausting. One afternoon, I had a rare moment of quiet at home while the kids were at Sarah's for the weekend. I sat on the porch, sipping coffee and flipping through an old photo album I'd found while cleaning out the attic. The pictures were a time capsule of our life together, weddings, birthdays, vacations, and everyday moments that felt so ordinary at the time but now seemed priceless. Looking at those photos, I realized something I hadn't before: my time with Sarah hadn't been all bad. In fact, most of it had been good. We'd built a life together, raised two incredible kids, and shared years of laughter and love. Yes, it had ended painfully, but those good memories weren't invalidated by how it ended. They were still a part of my story. Later that week, when I dropped the kids off at Sarah's, I decided to say what I'd been holding back for years. As the kids ran inside, I lingered at the door. "Sarah," I started, my voice steadier than I expected, "I just wanted to say, I forgive you." Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. "Ethan, I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "I'm not saying what you did was okay. But holding on to the anger, it's been eating me alive. And I'm tired of it. I think it's time for both of us to let it go." She nodded slowly, her expression a mix of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I've carried a lot of guilt, and hearing that, it means more than you know." It wasn't a dramatic moment, no tearful hugs or profound declarations, but it felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time, I walked away from Sarah's house without the usual heaviness in my chest. Forgiving Sarah was one thing, but forgiving myself was another challenge entirely. I had spent so much time questioning my worth, blaming myself for not seeing the signs or being the perfect husband. Letting go of that self-blame required me to accept a hard truth: I wasn't perfect, but I wasn't responsible for her choices. I had done the best I could with the tools I had at the time, and that had to be enough. With forgiveness came clarity. I no longer saw Sarah as the villain in my story, nor myself as a victim. We were just two flawed people who had shared a life, made mistakes, and found a way to move forward. And for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was ready to close that chapter for good and step fully into the life I was creating, a life filled with love, growth, and hope for the future. With forgiveness came the freedom to truly focus on the life ahead of me. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to the weight of the past. Instead, I was building a stronger, healthier foundation for myself, my kids, and the relationships that mattered most. The kids had adjusted surprisingly well. Lila was thriving in high school, her artistic talents blossoming in ways I couldn't have imagined. She'd even won an award for a mural she painted for her school, and seeing her beam with pride at the ceremony was one of those moments that reminded me why all the hard work was worth it. Jake, ever the curious tinkerer, had joined a robotics club and seemed to have a knack for problem solving. Watching them both grow into their own gave me an immense sense of pride. Dawn had become an integral part of my life, and her relationship with Lila and Jake continued to strengthen. She never tried to replace Sarah in their eyes, she was simply there, steady and supportive, offering the kind of warmth and kindness that drew people to her naturally. One evening, Jake asked, "Is Dawn going to be part of our family forever?" His innocent question caught me off guard, but it planted a seed. I started to think seriously about what the future might look like with Dawn. I wasn't rushing into anything, I'd learned my lesson about taking things slow, but the thought of sharing my life with her felt less daunting and more exciting. She had brought so much light into our lives, and I could see myself building something lasting with her. At work, the landscaping business continued to thrive. I had finally struck a balance between growing the company and maintaining a personal life, thanks in no small part to learning how to delegate. Letting go of the need to control every aspect of the business had been a challenge, but it also allowed me to focus on the parts of my job that I loved the most, working with clients and creating designs that transformed spaces. I even found time to give back to the community. Partnering with local schools, I started a program that taught kids about gardening and landscaping. Watching their excitement as they planted flowers or learned how to care for a vegetable garden was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. It felt good to be making a difference, not just for my family but for others as well. One evening, as Dawn and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, I realized how far I'd come. The man sitting there wasn't the same one who had been shattered by betrayal and loss. I was stronger, more self-aware, and more open to the unexpected twists and turns of life. "You've changed," Dawn said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "How so?" I asked, turning to her. "You seem lighter," she said, her eyes warm and kind. "Like you've let go of something you've been carrying for a long time." I nodded, taking in her words. "I think I have," I admitted. "For the first time, I feel like I'm not just surviving, I'm actually living." Dawn reached for my hand, and in that quiet moment, I realized how grateful I was for everything that had brought me to this point. The heartbreak, the struggles, the lessons, it had all led me here, to a life that felt fuller and more meaningful than I ever could have imagined. The future wasn't something I feared anymore. It was something I looked forward to. Looking back on everything that had happened, the heartbreak, the loss, the rebuilding, I realized that my life had become a story of resilience. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but in many ways, it was better because of the lessons I'd learned along the way. The kids were the biggest reminder of how far I'd come. Lila was preparing for college now, her art portfolio already impressing admissions counselors. Jake had entered middle school and was excelling in his robotics competitions. Watching them grow into such remarkable young people filled me with pride, and I knew that no matter what challenges we'd faced, they were going to be okay. More than okay, they were going to thrive. Dawn and I continued to build our relationship, and though I wasn't rushing into marriage, we were laying the groundwork for something lasting. She had become not only a partner to me but a true member of our family, and seeing how much the kids loved and trusted her made me realize just how lucky I was to have found someone so special. Sarah and I had reached a place of mutual respect. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was a functional partnership for the sake of the kids. We had both moved on, and while the wounds of the past hadn't disappeared entirely, they no longer defined our interactions. I could even look at her and feel a sense of gratitude for the good years we'd shared, despite how it had all ended. At work, I'd achieved a level of success that I hadn't thought possible. The landscaping business had expanded to 2 locations, and we were thriving. But more importantly, I'd learned to set boundaries. Work no longer consumed me, it was a part of my life, not the center of it. I had time for my kids, my hobbies, and for myself. On a crisp autumn evening, as the kids played in the yard and Dawn sat beside me on the porch, I took a moment to soak it all in. The golden light of the setting sun bathed everything in a warm glow, and the laughter of my children filled the air. It was one of those perfect, fleeting moments that reminded me of what truly mattered. If I could go back and change things, would I? The answer, I realized, was no. Every struggle, every tear, every moment of doubt had shaped me into the person I was today, a person I was proud to be. Life hadn't gone according to plan, but it had led me to a place of peace, love, and purpose. To anyone out there who's going through what I went through, I want to say this: it's going to hurt. It's going to feel impossible at times. But if you keep moving forward, even just one step at a time, you'll get through it. And when you come out the other side, you might just find a life that's better than you ever imagined. This is where my story ends, or maybe it's just the beginning of a new one. Either way, I'm ready for whatever comes next.